Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Lorenda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Emergency Salvage of Museum Collections. This webinar will be presented by Kasey Lee of BCHERN. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the work of the projects described in this webinar have been carried out. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, BC. They develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is, redefine how knowledge is shared, which is quite fitting for a webinar sponsor. We thank Lucidia for sponsoring BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. As I mentioned, I am Lorenda Calvert, your host for today. I am also BCMA's programs coordinator. I am still new to Zoom, so bear with me if there are any technical challenges. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our operations manager, is standing by to assist. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you are reading this slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. If you can't, don't shout at your screen because we won't be able to hear you. Simply use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden, so if you hold your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, the feature menu should emerge. Use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions out to the host. There will be a time period at the end for question and answer. You can save them to the end. That's the chat feature there. This month's presenter is Kasey Lee of BCHERN. Now, Kasey, over to you. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a sec.
Okay, thank you, Lorenda. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and maybe you can just tell me if this is working. Does that work?
I don't see anything yet.
Seems so simple, and yet sometimes it just doesn't go as planned. Okay, I'm going to back up a stage. How's that?
I see it now.
Yay. Okay. Well, I'm here, and I hope you're all doing well out there on this rainy afternoon. I'm Kasey Lee. Due to the current COVID-19 crisis, I'm delivering this webinar from home. So really hoping that the technology cooperates, as it has been good lately, but then it throws me a curveball every once in a while. So I'm drawing on my good karma right now and hoping the dog doesn't bark at the wrong moment. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars produced and delivered by the BCHERN. My apologies in advance if there's a little repetition for those who attended the first webinar a couple of weeks ago. I do want to briefly acquaint our new participants with the BCHERN and the very basics of emergency response before going more deeply into collection salvage. I'm Kasey Lee, the Senior Conservator at the Royal BC Museum, where I have worked for the past 16 years. I specialize in objects conservation, having received a Master of Art Conservation degree from Queen's University in 1990. I've participated in numerous emergency responses involving collections at a variety of institutions and historic sites. And I've been a BCHERN steering committee member since its inception. Next week, if you stick around, you'll meet Tara Fraser, who is the head conservator at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Tara attended the Master of Art Conservation program at Queen's University as well in 1990, specializing in paper conservation. She's delivered numerous disaster response workshops for museums and archives in North America. Tara has also written many disaster plans for a variety of cultural institutions and participated in several emergency responses involving cultural collections. BCHERN activities are funded in part by a grant from the Government of Canada, Museums Assistance Program. And a shout out to Anne Deplanche, a private conservator here in BC and part of the BCHERN steering group and leader of the Northern Zone. Anne collaborated on the development of this webinar. Thank you, Anne. BCHERN is an acronym for the British Columbia Heritage Emergency Response Network. The BCHERN is a collection of allied cultural workers across the province of British Columbia. It's growing and interconnecting people through training and membership. The main goal is to increase emergency response capacity and confidence on the local level all around the province. BCHERN was born from an identified lack of unified support for disaster response and collection salvage in the province. Several disasters occurred within a short period of time, including a flood at the Museum of Anthropology and a fire at a remote Indigenous cultural center in BC. And in light of the growing risk to collections resulting from climate change, a group of conservators began to collaborate over the past 6 years to create the BCHERN. BCHERN has delivered 2 workshops on collections salvage to the BC conservation community, as well as to the broader community of collections care workers in BC. We were also able to build 4 mobile salvage kits and to sign a statement of cooperation among the 6 largest cultural institutions to, quote, ensure the existence of a safe and rapid salvage response to emergencies that may impact heritage and cultural collections, unquote. We've also been able to partner with the BCMA to present workshops and these webinars and to host our webpage. So whether or not you join the BCHERN, you now have access to emergency response and salvage supplies, online resources, training, and professional advice when you need it most. I'll say a bit more about how to join the BCHERN at the end of this webinar. If you're looking for instruction on emergency preparedness or how to create a disaster plan, the Canadian Conservation Institute has a number of resources to help you out, including workshops, manuals, and site visits. Please contact them directly. One moment. One slide behind. Okay, so now I'm going to recap a little information that I presented in the last webinar on initial response procedures and considerations that lead up to collection salvage. Apologies to those who heard this 2 weeks ago, so I will promise to be very brief. Collections-related emergencies generally tend to unfold in a predictable fashion. A timeline can be visualized, though it may be highly compressed or extremely delayed, depending on circumstances. History tells us that normal operations are never quite the same after an emergency. During the initial response, your prime concern will be securing the site and mobilizing a collections response team. Emergency services may be on site and you may have to wait for permission to access the collections. This first phase may last from hours to days. In the orientation phase, you will complete your assessment of the site and the collection. This is the time to put together a plan for salvaging and documenting the emergency and the collection. During the stabilization phase, triage of the collection will begin, followed closely by actions to halt and even reverse some damage. This work may take weeks, even months. The monitoring phase involves ongoing treatment of the collection, as objects often move around off-site to conservators, to freezers, back to conservators, and then hopefully back to you. At the same time, reestablishing control of the museum environment and even reopening to the public may take place. This will be a lengthy time of transition that may take years to complete. And finally, the recording phase is a time of documentation, reflection, and sharing the experience with others. Collections may continue to go through long-term treatments and require rehousing. Throughout the emergency response, rigorous documentation is required. There are generally 2 types of documentation. First, recording of the disaster, the event and its management. This can be assigned to a single recorder. And second, the documentation of the collection and salvage procedures. You may need several recorders across the site and over time to execute this type of documentation. Always start with complete written and photo documentation of the disaster area. Talk to the first responders and get as much information as possible from them before they leave. Be sure to get their contact information, or at least their names, in case follow-up is required. All of this information is needed for questions of liability and insurance, but can also be very useful for the purpose of locating the objects in the future, assessing further problems, or for the annual report or other reports of the institution, or presentation to others in the aftermath. Then document your site assessment and decisions that are made. This is a good time to look at the risks to people and come up with a health and safety plan. Then you can turn your attention to the state of the collections. Finally, record all salvage operations. When it comes to collections documentation, be sure to record triage decisions, stabilization treatments, and recommendations for future treatments. And pay scrupulous attention to labels and numbers on objects. Taking copious amounts of pictures will help you to reunite artifacts with their information as the salvage and recovery progress. Your health and safety are more important than any of the collections that may have been damaged in a disaster. You need to take stock of your personal protective equipment, PPE. How much do you need? Where should you keep it? How will it be maintained? And what about the others? What are their needs? After this webinar, go home and find a backpack or duffel bag and start to build your personalized grab-and-go kit. Include health and safety supplies, documentation tools, and a few treats. When you get the call, even before you leave for the site, gain information, ensure you're physically and mentally prepared, and find that grab-and-go kit. When you arrive, you'll need to assess the hazards and clearly communicate them to the other workers and document them. Some of this information will be gleaned from other first responders. Check in on your personal well-being and that of others regularly. Remember to follow up afterward with emergency response plan changes, completing and filing documentation, and replenishing supplies. This is a list, a visual of a typical grab-and-go bag. Lorinda will be sending you a list similar to this in follow-up after the webinar, so you can put your pencils down at this point. And that's just a reminder to you, Lorinda, that we did that for the last workshop, so it would be nice to do that again for this workshop, or webinar, I should say. Psychological impacts of a disaster are numerous and differ between individuals. In each stage of an emergency, there are different challenges. During the initial impact, some people may panic while others sprint into focused action. This is the time to take a deep breath, gather information, and draw on your support network. Your personal and professional obligations will have to be sorted out. Optimism often ensues as your team comes together, people settle into their roles and find their stride. This will often get you through the early hours and days of the crisis. Later, inevitably, fatigue and disillusionment set in. The work can become overwhelming, especially when other priorities creep in, distracting you from completing tasks and documentation. It's critical to allot time to yourself and others, or risk burnout at this stage. It may be necessary to adjust roles and responsibilities. If a team member is clearly struggling, it may be time to send that person for donuts. Moving into recovery, acceptance usually takes over. The end may be in sight, or at least imaginable. And eventually, you'll find time for reflectance and healing. Sharing the experience with others is often helpful. Throughout the event, stress and mental exhaustion are ever-present threats. So be alert for the signs and don't forget to celebrate even the minor successes. Once you've determined that the site is safe to access and you're confident that there are spaces available for collections work, you can begin salvage and recovery. So just to back up, salvage. It is the assessment, protection, and retrieval of collection objects at the site of an emergency with the goal of preventing further damage. Recovery covers all of the actions taken to return the objects to a stable condition. The first thing that you will do when you have access to the collection is to set up and implement a triage plan. Resist the urge to act before planning. Again, slow down and begin with a damage assessment. Assess the extent of the area affected. It could be just one display case, or it could be several buildings on a site in a large-scale disaster. I think back to an emergency at the Royal BC Museum that happened in the evening, late at night. It was actually midnight when I got the call. There was an evening catered event, and the caterer's cart nicked the corner of a very large glass display case, shattering the glass, leaving shards in the case amongst the artifacts. So I was called in, as well as a couple of other people, at a late hour to ensure that not only the artifacts were safely retrieved from that situation, but also that the whole gallery could be open to the public the next morning. So this was an emergency and required the same type of assessment and approach that a large-scale disaster would dictate. Consider access and available spaces. Is it safe for you? Is it safe for the artifacts? I recall an incident not long ago at the Royal BC Museum when a sprinkler head broke in our large glass lobby at the entrance. People sprang into action. It was early in the morning, and fortunately there were several people there already. But what we realized in retrospect was that there were electrical outlets set into the floor in the glass lobby, and there could have been an electrical hazard. So we know that for next time. We've written it into our plan, and hopefully we will respond slightly differently and ensure that the power is off to the whole area in advance. And how much damage is there? What damage has already occurred, and what may yet occur? So even if it's just an overflowing toilet or a small leak or rising damp, we have to consider that the relative humidity might be impacted. So while tradespeople are responding, collections people should be there and checking the relative humidity and ensuring that collections in the vicinity aren't impacted by that rise in RH. So what do you rescue first? Triage is the term we use. It's a medical term. It involves assigning degrees of urgency to the wounded or ill, or in our case, the collection. It's unique to each individual item or person and the specific situation. Think about the vulnerability and values of each collection object. The values including aesthetic, sentimental, financial values of the collection. And set priorities. Identify high value items, those that have been damaged and those at risk of being damaged. Remember, there are different kinds of value, so try to look beyond monetary value. For example, type specimens and iconic objects should be at the top of your priority list. Identify other objects that have been damaged or are at risk of being damaged. Identify objects that appear to be beyond help. If possible, consult a conservator because there are often treatments that may save an object that looks hopeless. Your first priority will be the highest value items that are most vulnerable to damage. If you're lucky, your high value objects have already been flagged in your disaster plan. Once the triage step is complete, or even before it's complete, you must be sure to begin tracking objects. During an emergency, objects will be relocated several times. It's important to know the exact state and location of all of the collection objects, all of the time. Salvage documentation focuses on collections and their movements. Track objects with unique numbers. These could be the catalog numbers originally assigned to the object, but often when things are wet and dirty and too fragile to manipulate, it's better to begin with a new salvage numbering system. These numbers can then be married up with the original collection numbers once the dust has settled. You may assign numbers to an object with tags or even self-adhesive labels. Other more elaborate solutions can also be chosen, like tear-off labels or digital applications. There are several solutions for tracking object movements. You may create handwritten or digital lists or use pre-printed existing forms. Label and record objects that are parts of a group and try to keep them together if possible. Save damaged labels, even if not completely legible. Objects may be completely devalued if the label is lost. This is an example of a tear-off labeling system that was developed in Switzerland. These labels can be printed in advance of an emergency. They're extremely useful for tracking objects through the salvage and recovery process. There are 4 sections that can be completed in pencil and attached to the object. Each page of a label has a salvage number that is not related to the inventory number. Manipulating fragile objects in order to search for the inventory numbers, as I mentioned, which have already become unreadable or lost, is unnecessary. The inventory number can be entered later as it is recognized. Slip A stays on the pad, which is the main inventory log. The 3 remaining parts are removed in one piece and attached to the object. Slip B is an extra slip that can be removed at any step if objects are directly transferred to a conservator, for example, and mailed back to the museum. Slip C and D remain on the object. Slip C is the conservation report growing as salvage procedures unfold. Whenever an object is handled or treated, adding a cross or a note will continue the report. Information from Slip C can be entered into the museum database using the salvage number as an interface. Slip D remains on the object until the museum is absolutely sure that all objects have been correctly reintegrated and that no confusion of inventory numbers has occurred. Before you can physically begin the salvage of collections, you must prepare spaces. Can the objects remain where they are? Is it safe for the people and the collection? Often this is not the case. If you move the objects, where will they go? Another room? Outdoors? To a conservator? To a freezing facility? Wherever the objects go, there must be a plan for those places. A space plan will involve access. How do you get into the space? How long will you have the space available to you? Security. How will you secure the space? How will you have access? And who will have access to that space? Environment. Does the space have the right environment for the objects and the people? Does it have a window? Does it have running water? Equipment and supplies. What do you need and how will you get it to the space? Do you have enough power and light? And transport. How will you get people and objects to and through the space? You will need space for possibly cool or cold and dry storage. Isolation of contaminated materials. And you'll need to monitor these spaces for temperature, relative humidity, pests, and to ensure that security is ongoing. And of course, there's a possibility of freezer space as well. Outdoor spaces can be used if secure and the weather cooperates. Be sure to shade things from direct sunlight if possible, and cover loosely to prevent bird droppings and other soiling. Security is often a real concern in outdoor spaces. Even if the area is secure from intruders, contractors and others in the area who are not directly involved with the collection salvage may inadvertently do harm. I think back to a story related to me by Gail Ninema, who responded to the Museum of the Highwoods disaster during the floods in southern Alberta a few years ago. And Gail had laid out a number of textiles outdoors onto polyethylene sheeting to allow them to dry. And when she came back to her textiles, she was aghast at the sight of work boot footprints traipsing over all of the textiles. So the workers, it wasn't their priority. They were working on other parts of site mitigation and just didn't realize that they were walking over artifacts at the time. These things happen in an uncontrolled situation. It's often necessary to move the collection, whether or not it's the safest choice for the objects. Be aware that many objects will be in an extremely fragile state. Some things may be stuck together, while others will fall to pieces. Be sure to touch surfaces as little as possible, and I'm going to repeat this several times, because dirt can be ground in, and finishes and other surface treatments can be rubbed off. And unlike the gentleman in this photo, do try to wear nitrile gloves at all times. It will protect your hands as well as the objects. The way that you move objects will often determine the extent of damage in the end. Damaged museum artifacts and specimens require thoughtful support. If possible, blot some of the moisture out using towels or blotting paper. Buttons and embellishments may tear right through a textile. Basketry, leather, and natural history specimens can be extremely fragile when wet. By the way, be sure to wear PPE when handling natural history specimens, as they can be contaminated with pesticide residues. Beware of finishes on wood and other decorated surfaces that may flake off or even rub off when wet or otherwise damaged. Keep and tag any small bits that fall off or larger pieces that separate. Old repairs to ceramics and glass may give way, so be sure to provide extra support and padding to these objects, including any pieces that do come apart. Wet objects are often heavy and fragile. Provide more support than you would normally, always cradling things from beneath. Plan ahead and make sure that you have the supplies that you need. Always use two hands, which means another person may have to open doors or prepare surfaces for you. Don't lift things, again, by handles, rims, or other parts that may not be strong enough to hold the weight of the object while it is wet or damaged. Pack wet and dry materials separately. Separate things to prevent sticking together, dyes from staining adjacent materials, and for air circulation. Wax paper is very useful for separating objects. Decide if objects can be cleaned or just blotted before packing, and pad out basketry and leather that may collapse under its own weight using towels or unprinted paper. Keep drawers and other furniture parts in their normal positions. Otherwise, they may warp during drying and never fit back into place. Document and label everything. Take a lot of photos. Use plastic or other waterproof containers. Milk crates are great for this because they give nice rigid support, but also allow some movement of air through the contents. Don't overpack or pack boxes or crates too heavily. And think about how you might streamline the recovery operation. Bag books in small lots if they're going to be frozen, making the loads lighter and the retrieval of small groups possible. Remember, if you seal items in bags or plastic totes, you will get mold very quickly, often within 48 hours or so. So this is just a temporary measure. And pad out, label, and try not to stack items one upon another. Once the objects are supported and or packed, you'll have to move them. This is one of the riskiest stages of the salvage operation. Try to handle objects by their support or container, as direct handling risks driving in soot or dirt, making cleaning much more difficult. Remember, labels must follow along with the object, and the move must be recorded. Stabilization and buying time are the main goals of the salvage operation. This may simply involve keeping wet objects wet and dry objects dry. but it may also involve freezing objects that can't be safely dried or that are at risk of mold or other physical damage. Many objects that are already saturated may not be damaged further if they remain temporarily immersed in water or are wrapped to prevent drying. Keep wet to prevent mold growth on already saturated material. Keep wet to prevent damage by soluble salts from uncontrolled drying. Keep wet when freezing is inappropriate or may be delayed or is not possible at all. Immerse objects in clean, cool water or pack in plastic to prevent them from drying too quickly. Limit to short periods or for moving items to a recovery site. Watch out for things that are stuck together. Sometimes it's possible to separate them while they're wet. It's often impossible after they dry. Do not wet out materials that are simply damp or dry. Many, but not all materials can be safely frozen and kept frozen for long periods in a chest freezer, walk-in freezer, or freezer truck to buy time. Freeze to prevent or stop mold growth if wet objects and records cannot be dried within 48 hours. Freeze organic materials prone to mold growth, such as paper, books, textiles, skin and leather, as well as many photographic materials. I believe that Tara is going to go into that in more detail next week. Freeze materials that will be vacuum freeze dried, and this works well for study skins and taxidermy specimens. And freeze to permit controlled cleaning or drying later on. You can use chest freezers, walk-in freezers, freezer trucks, or contracted commercial freezers. Be careful not to freeze materials that are likely to be damaged by freezing. This would include things like painted or stenciled textiles or textiles with beadwork, fluid preserved specimens, if they're not already frozen, and most paintings and historical photographs. Audio or videotapes, CDs, and DVDs should not be frozen. Cleaning can be very destructive if not carried out with caution and proper techniques. Be sure to consult a conservator whenever you're in doubt. You may need to unframe some objects, textiles, or in this case, that's a textile too, in the small oval frame. You may need to unframe them in order to clean them properly and dry them. Be careful that metals are not scratched. Their surfaces can easily be etched if they're rubbed or even if they're handled with bare hands. It's always preferable to use streaming water over surfaces, especially wood surfaces, rather than grinding in dirt with rags or other cleaners. Expect finishes to blanch and change appearance. Don't try to buff or otherwise restore these finishes. This is specialized work that should take place after the piece is dried. Much damage can occur while objects are dried. The most appropriate drying method depends on a number of factors: the type of materials that are wet, the number of items that need drying, and the resources available for drying, such as space, material and equipment, people, funds. Consult a conservator if you would like some guidance on this step. For textiles, watch for corroding metal zippers and buttons, other surface or embellishments. Roll and blot them with towels, if they're large textiles especially, such as linens, tapestries, and carpets. For leather, rawhide, buckskin, other skins, you can manipulate the skins during the drying process to retain flexibility. You may also want to pad them out to retain shape during the drying. For natural history specimens, they may be very heavy when wet. Begin drying these immediately or freeze them. Fast air dry minerals and fossils to prevent oxidation. Dry herbarium sheets under gentle pressure. For bone, ivory, horn, shell, blot off excess moisture and dry slowly. And for metals, dry them quickly to avoid corrosion. For wood, blot and wrap loosely to slow dry. That will avoid warping and cracking. Keep the relative humidity low to prevent mold growth and provide good air circulation. If mold does start to grow, change your drying strategy and use personal protective equipment to protect yourself. Inset upholstered elements or cushions may be removed and dried separately, but do be sure to label them. There are various drying techniques that are appropriate for different artifacts and specimens and different situations. These techniques are useful for wet or partially wet objects that won't be frozen. Warning, do not use heat as you're drying these things. It can be very destructive and also present hazards. A drying tent or tunnel may be set up to facilitate air circulation. This can be constructed very simply out of a long table or several adjoining tables that are covered in poly sheeting that drapes to the floor. Place a fan at one end and direct the air through the tent with objects supported inside. Be sure to not set up objects so that there's a domino effect if one topples. If a drying tent is not feasible, you don't have the plastic on hand or space is limited, you can still speed up drying by spacing out objects on a surface and running fans for air circulation. Be sure to not dislodge objects from tables if the fan velocity is too strong. You may actually have to weight down papers. Or you may simply lay objects out on tables, hang them from clotheslines, or stack them on shelves, as long as the relative humidity in the area is reasonably low, under about 60%. A stabilized object is not necessarily ready for use or exhibit. The purpose of salvage and short-term recovery techniques is to stabilize objects, preventing further damage or loss. At this point, the objects or records may still appear damaged. Further conservation treatment may be necessary before an item can be used or put on display. In some cases, additional cleaning or repair may be more effective if done soon. For other objects, treatment can wait until the object needs to be used or when funds are available. An emergency may damage the housing or storage container as well, or in fortunate circumstances, instead of the object. Storage or display housing that is compromised should be replaced. Let go when the damage is too severe. Untreatable damage due to an emergency incident may be reason for deaccessioning if what remains is no longer of any value. Consult a conservator to make sure treatment is not possible. Discuss options with your insurance company representative. Establish protocol in deaccessioning policies suitable for emergency situations, and ensure that items are disposed of in a secure manner. The return or recovery stage may go on for years, but at some point, normal or new normal operations will have to resume. Collections that were moved off-site for treatment or other reasons will be returned to the museum. Rehousing and perhaps upgrades to exhibits and storage will be completed. If luck and good management are on your side, the collection may be in better condition post-emergency than it was previously. Make sure that your rigorous documentation continues as collections arrive home. Numbers and condition are recorded, and new storage or exhibit space is organized. Now, I'd like to just go over a few thoughts about COVID-19 and the fact that a lot of our cultural institutions are closed or running with minimal operations at this time. If you missed it, the AIC, American Institute for Conservation, Connecting to Collections webinar that was titled Collections Care in the Age of COVID is a really valuable resource. They did tape the webinar, so you can access that through the AIC website. There are other online venues for information sharing popping up each day as well. This is the time to ensure that your emergency response plan is up to date with a pandemic response plan as well. I was involved in creating one for the Royal BC Museum, and it will involve measures that you may not have foreseen prior to this pandemic episode. Tomorrow, check to be sure your emergency response vendors are still working and available. If you have to respond to an emergency at the museum, access permission and ID may be necessary to get past enforcement. Take inventory on who is fit tested and has an N95 respirator. That's a respirator, not a mask, because these will come in handy if masks run out or have been given away during the crisis. Try testing your emergency response plan with e-meeting tabletop exercises. If you have to close your site, check out the CCI note 1/3 called Closing of Museum for the Winter. Ensure that collections are securely stored and covered, and keep up the housekeeping, if at all possible, to discourage pests. This is a perfect time for a really deep clean of your collection storage areas and exhibit galleries. If you have them, place insect and rodent traps around vulnerable collections. Try to visit the site and collections regularly, if possible, to check for environmental and pest control issues, among other things. Check in with local emergency responders to let them know who is and who is not on site. And if you can't get on site, do a FaceTime walkthrough if there is security staff there to check for insects, environment, conservation treatments in progress, and so on. Be sure to document everything that you've learned through this crisis. Take time for your mental health and check in with your colleagues regularly. Take care of your physical health. Be sure to get some exercise, eat well. I don't have any cookies at my desk anymore. It was a necessity. And ergonomics of your workstation if you're working from home. This is going on for quite some time, so you can do damage to your body if you don't have proper ergonomics. Take advantage of community resources to keep you healthy and connected. And this includes the BCHERN. The CCI emergency contact number and Facebook page will still receive and respond to you during this crisis. Their number is on the screen there. When it's time to think about reopening your doors, ensure everyone is aware that collections cannot be decontaminated like other surfaces. You cannot simply wipe them with an alcohol wipe. This can create a great deal of damage. The current evidence shows that this virus in particular, cannot live in a viable state on a surface for more than 72 hours. So chances are your collections will not be contaminated with the virus in any form that will threaten your health when you get back to them. When planning for reopening, you may need to stage or limit staff and visitors to maintain physical distancing. Check to see if your PPE needs replenishing, if some has been used for cleaning or donated to emergency services. Ensure that you have adequate hand sanitizing stations for staff and public alike. We're all headed into uncharted waters, so watch, listen, and adapt as you go. Fortunately, we're all in this together. So just to conclude, these are a few resources that would be wonderful additions to your bookshelf if they're not there already. The Getty Institute's step-by-step guide for building an emergency preparedness plan is a valuable resource. UNESCO's Disaster Risk Management Manual is an actual manual that you can follow. ICROM has two publications, one on collection salvage and one on emergency response. Wonderful publications. CCI's emergency response planning workbook can be obtained through contact with CCI. Irene Karsten is usually the person to contact about that. You can get that through their website or by calling the number that I gave before, and we'll show you again. And as well, the Alberta Museums Association Emergency Preparedness Manual called HELP is a wonderfully organized and step-by-step guide to emergency response for collections. So I said I'd get back to it, the BCHERN membership. It does not require any financial contribution. We ask only that you come prepared with these 4 things. A disaster plan for your institution. So again, you can talk to CCI if you haven't been able to tackle this on your own. Emergency collection salvage supplies, even the most basic, required for health and safety. So that would be your grab and go kit. Completion of training through one of the BCHERN regional workshops. So this is an introduction to emergency response and collection salvage, but the workshops will give you a much greater enhanced training opportunity with hands-on experience. So we recommend that you attend one of the workshops. Several are upcoming, although there may be delays due to the COVID crisis. So stay tuned for dates for those. And you'll need a desire to support others in the event of an emergency. This may be simply putting your name on the call list in order to provide emotional support, or it could be sharing supplies and resources with others in nearby institutions. So here are your contacts. Check out the BCMA webpage for BCHERN, as well as other resource pages. Contact one of the conservators on this slide or another conservator in your contacts list. Don't forget that CCI is a national cultural heritage resource organization with a 24/7 emergency response line. And that's the end of my presentation today. I hope you got a few great tips out of that, as well as some general knowledge. And thank you for joining me today. And over to you, Lorinda.
Thank you very much, Kasey. I'm just going to take over the screen here. Thank you again. That was so enlightening and very wonderful. I myself have really been thinking about what reopening or a returning to our institutes will look like. So that was really lovely that you were able to integrate that into your webinar today. I would love to open the floor for questions. So if you're able to use the chat function, you can hover over the bottom or top of your screen and you should be able to see the chat function there if you'd like to share anything. Kasey, maybe I will dive in. Like I mentioned, I have been spending a lot of time these past few days thinking about a reopening of institutes. Do you have any additional thoughts or considerations about what our institutes should consider with COVID, in addition to what you've already shared?
Yeah, that's something that we're exploring at the Royal BC Museum right now, and there are a lot of concerns, some involving the collections, many that don't involve the collections, a lot of public-facing considerations in terms of staging the opening. Of course, we don't know the details of how we will open, and various cultural institutions will probably approach it differently depending on their resources and their regional directives. But it may be necessary that we will have to open to only a few visitors at a time. We may have different work situations. Some people will be possibly working from home for much longer, even after the museum opens. So that will impact our collections care in the long run. We'll have to look at who is going to be on site. Perhaps we can take turns, we can do odd days, partial days, what have you, but it will be great to have a full complement of collections care staff on site, and that can be anyone from the director to contracted housekeepers, but somebody who's looking out, doing regular inspections of collection storage and exhibits, checking for pests, checking traps if you've been able to put out some pest control traps. And yeah, it's mostly about how you're going to get the people to the collections. And right now it's certainly a major concern because collections, while they're not being attended to, don't necessarily just sit there and wait for us to get back. So we'll get back, assess the situation. Hopefully there won't be much change. There might be some cleaning that needs to be done, but it will be quite individual on how to approach that.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, thank you. We do have a question here. One of the slides mentioned performing a slow dry for wooden materials. Could you please clarify? Does this mean air dry?
Yeah, that is a form of air drying. So as opposed to laying things out on a table or in a tunnel, you might want to cover them loosely with polyethylene, or ensure that you don't expose them to extremely dry air. So you might not want to take them outside. You might not want to expose them to direct sunlight, or if you're in the interior of BC and your relative humidity is around 20% in midsummer, then you might want to keep them inside or at least covered so that they don't dry too quickly. It's that rapid drying that causes a lot of the warping and cracking, checking of surfaces. So it's a type of drying that you have to monitor really closely, because of course if you impede the drying too much, which did happen actually in one emergency response that I worked on in Alberta many years ago, when we brought all the furniture outside of a flooded museum and left the local people to monitor it as it sat under polyethylene sheeting in the outdoors. And those people were called to basically scoop muck out of their building and perform a lot of other tasks. And we're assuming that the objects that were outside would be okay because that's how the conservators left them. And we didn't communicate well enough that they have to be checked regularly. So they did get mold growth on their furniture, and that then presented another problem that they had to deal with, very unfortunately. So that was a learning experience for me as well as everyone else involved. So slow drying has to be monitored, and if it looks like the drying is not happening and mold might become an issue, then perhaps covering is not an option. I hope that makes sense. I rambled a bit.
Thank you. I feel like that was something you touched upon in this webinar and your previous ones, to slow down and take the time, not just in regards to air drying materials, but just in general, to slow down, take a breath, and take the time as you move forward. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just going to give a moment to see if there are any other questions in our chat function here. And we do still have a few moments, Kasey, if you wanted to add any last thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, this was really an introduction, and I just mentioned that the workshops do give a little bit more hands-on learning, which is so valuable for emergency response and especially for collection salvage. When we did the workshop in Prince George, people were hungry for more knowledge. They were making assumptions based on the knowledge that they had. Things like perhaps things that were just slightly wet should be immersed in water, and that might help separate coated papers, some photographs and such. Whereas really things that are only slightly wet, you probably don't want to fully immerse them, not yourself anyways. That would be a conservation treatment down the line, may or may not be successful. But there's a lot of experience that goes into how to deal with specific objects in specific states of deterioration. So the workshops are great for that. We've expanded the workshop to 2 days because people did give us the feedback that they wanted to know more about how to handle very specific objects in very specific states of wetness or breakage, etc. So, so yeah, I encourage people to take a workshop, but also to talk to people who have been involved in emergency salvage situations, and to share the information that you learn along the way if you are involved in any of these situations, because we learn a lot from one another.
Thank you. And we actually have one last question here from Tara Fraser. Based on your experience and knowledge, can you talk about improvements that could be made to current museum storage that would pay off in the event of a disaster?
Good question, Tara. Well, certainly one of the main tenets of storage areas is that you don't put anything on the floor. So if you have things resting on the floor now, which does happen even temporarily, that might be something that you could address right away. Even if things are lifted just a few inches off the floor, most floods only impact the first few inches of a room of an interior location. So if you can ensure that things are lifted off the floor, even if it's a painting leaning against a wall because it's not in permanent storage, make sure it's up on blocks. That'll help your frame from being abraded, but also ensure that if there is water in there, that that it may not be affected. Also, earthquake mitigation in our part of the world on the West Coast. Really look at your shelving and your supports, even artifacts on shelving. Make sure that your shelf has a lip and things aren't going to walk off. There are a lot of earthquake mitigation techniques that have been documented, and it might be time to go through and take a look at that. In terms of the pandemic, this was a bit of a disaster that none of us foresaw, or maybe we had inklings of it, but until it actually happened, the impact on the collections was surprising and illuminating. So thinking about your experience now and how a full-scale closure of your institution, if that's what happened, impacts your collections, and what you might do to mitigate that for next time. You know, perhaps having insect traps out there beforehand. Do know that pheromone traps don't last forever, so they're mostly just used for short-term attracting of insects that might be in the area, but just sticky blender traps on floors can be helpful.
Thank you so much. And just a follow-up from Tara saying, thank you, Kasey. That was very informative and so interesting.
Well, thank you, Tara.
And thank you so much, Kasey. That was really wonderful and very valuable for myself and for our participants today. Let me just move through my slides. Mark your calendars for our next webinar. We have another BCHERN webinar on Wednesday, April 29th, which is Emergency Salvage of Art and Archival Collections. We also have a webinar coming up on Wednesday, May 20th on Power Tools, Creating a Blueprint for Recruiting, Revitalizing, Recognizing Volunteers. And we have a free webinar on Wednesday, April 27th on Virtual Exhibits, Engagement, and Accessibility. Please remember, if you have any suggestions for topics in 2020 or wish to present one yourself, please email programs@museumsassociation.bc.ca. We'd love to know what topics interest you. Please do fill out our follow-up survey, which will be in your inboxes soon, as well as a recording of this webinar and the handout Kasey mentioned earlier. Lastly, if you are not already a member of the BCMA, please consider joining us and staying connected. Your membership benefits include free webinar participation, as well as access to all previously recorded webinars, reduced registration fees for our annual conference, regional workshops, and other events, access to Prody resources through our website, including the Roundup magazine, regular e-newsletters with up-to-date grant opportunities, job postings, and much, much more. More information can be found on our website. And thank you so much again for joining us.
And thank you so much, Lorinda.
It was my pleasure.